Can you guys see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay, everyone can see my screen. You can see very simple here. For those of you who last year saw my presentation here at the webinar, this is kind of an update to my research project. And today is especially focusing on the solutions, which are, of course, just kind of they're kind of like implications and solutions mixed together. Okay, just to give you a background, just in case you haven't or you didn't, you weren't here at last year's webinar. In terms of background, my research project was a follow-up to my PhD study, which was on teachers' perceptions and uses of technology. So basically, during that study, I was focused on, what the teacher's perspective and what what kind of decisions they made regarding using technology, in the classroom or out of the classroom. But during that study, one of the main observations that like side observations that I had was that students were always having even back then, I completed this study in 2011. And even back then, students were beginning to always have a smartphone in their hand in and out of the classroom. And when I interviewed teachers, this is a qualitative study, when I interviewed teachers, they started to make more and more comments about it, again, how this was kind of, in their minds and affecting their decision making. So again, in South Korea in particular, smartphones are probably on the leading edge. We have one of the highest saturation rates in the world. And especially during the pandemic, of course, it's been increased. The follow-up to my study, again, was to I had a couple different leads or implications that I wanted to look into. One of them was on maintenance, how that affected teachers' use of technology. But this one was to look at students, take the students' perspective, do a qualitative study, and see just what effect these phones were having on them, and so that teachers could make better decisions. And I looked through the research, and really most of the research was very specific. It was focused on specific aspects about smartphones, some of them very specific, but very few of them were really about the kind of holistic approach that would inform teacher decision making. So my methods, just like I did in my PhD study, I followed the same basic pattern where I used semi-structured interviews with some students at different levels. And this is a grounded theory-based qualitative study. So I used the interviews, and from that I gleaned some conclusions, some concepts, and I added those to a questionnaire, a survey questionnaire that I distributed at Korean universities and actually at an American university too, for foreign students who were studying English there, many of them Korean. And then I did semi-structured interviews in strand 3 as a kind of follow-up. And very interesting, again, the difference between grounded theory, I said this last year, but I think it's important to say, is if you look at the first blue box on the top under the red oval, you'll see that the basic scientific method, of course, is to generate a hypothesis at the beginning of your study, and then you test it. Whereas grounded theory doesn't do that. It asks a question, it has an area of interest, but then it collects data first. So it's actually more like what Sherlock Holmes kind of should have been like, if you say induction or deduction. Actually, most of that was confused in his novels, saying that, oh, it was deduction, Watson, when no, actually it was induction. So anyway, you can see that the hypothesis comes at the end. Very strange. Okay, so the results of my study, now that I've finished it, there were a lot of different results, but these are just some of the main ones. One of my participants used the expression "my other hand" to refer to her smartphone. So from that, there were a lot of different aspects related to that: dimensions, related to all the different ways that the smartphone was part of people's lives. So I actually dove into the area of extended mind, which is Andy Clark's and Philip Chalmers, David Chalmers' theory that was from 1998. But they had a lot to say about smartphones later too, and particularly the way that smartphones, because they're always in students' hands, then they are changing abilities, both physical and cognitive abilities, especially when it comes, in my study, I found that particularly navigation and the way time was conceived were two of the physical, really, the physical, time being a kind of physical thing in this aspect for me, but also cognition, the way that students actually thought about their lives and how they interacted with one another it was really amazing. Really, there's a lot of details to it, but I don't want to go too long here. YouTube actually, as a supplement too, was something that was surprising that came out of the study, which is that students were often finding that their offline classes were quite lacking, and that their teachers were giving unclear lectures. And so you can see there 76.7% of the survey participants, which was 152 participants, they 76.7% agreed or strongly agreed that they use YouTube as a supplement for poor lessons. Interestingly, 64.4% of them said that they still preferred the professor over YouTube, though, which again, I think there are different ways to explain that. And I won't get into it because I don't have time today. But the thing I want to focus on here today is the last bit. Personal responsibility for use. Most of the participants, an overwhelming amount, and this was with different items on the survey and during the interviews, but it was overwhelmingly a majority in every case, 70% or higher agree or strongly agreed with the idea that they use their smartphone too much and that it's their own fault, it's their own shortcoming. Okay, so this smartphone in your hand, if you're not familiar with the extended mind concept, it's the idea that your cognition extends beyond your mind into your physical body and beyond your body even into the environment. It's very similar to, if you know, the selfish gene by Dawkins and the extended phenotype. It's very similar. If you've read anything from Clark and Chalmers about this, they use an example of a man that they named Otto, who was basically using all these different devices to supplement his cognition. So he was actually thinking with, not thinking using. So these things are not tools in an extended mind concept. They're not tools. They're part of your actual brain. They're part of your thinking, your cognition, all of the devices that you use. And of course, Dawkins kind of said that too with the extended phenotype. Okay, the implications of the study for teacher decision-making on top, and for research, I'm adding on the bottom here, for teacher decision-making, teachers, I think, cannot ignore the changes. I think these are profound. You know, the results I got from my study were profound. You can't ignore that. Smartphones are really considered a student right these days. Should they be? Because part of the extended mind concept is that these devices, and Clark and Chalmers specifically said, smartphones are actually part of your cognition. So taking that away is kind of violating a person's rights. So teachers should think about that. These devices are actually physically also, as I mentioned, the student's other hand. So imagine cutting someone's hand off and then expecting them to kind of not have a reaction to that. So again, in my earlier study, teachers usually banned smartphones in the classroom. And so it was effectively, now that from this perspective, it was like the teachers were cutting their hands off when they came in and then returning their hands upon, finishing the class. So again, there's some more details, but again, I can't go too far into it. The implications for research were that basically the need for research to look more at the big picture and to realize that smartphones have really changed the way students think and the way that they exist in the world. And I think that that's not really being addressed. Okay, I'm going to finish up here quickly with the educational and corporate responsibility. The metacognitive economy is something you can look into that, again, Andy Clark has termed this. I'm not sure if it's his original term, but it has to do with these concepts about the new way that technology is kind of changing our conception of how to learn. But technology, smartphones or otherwise, they change our study methods, our concentration, our thinking, and our need for education. Again, these were all found in my study, and all of these implications are directly from my findings, linked directly to the aspects that I found. In terms of corporate responsibility, which is not usually discussed, technology is, of course, affecting these companies that make the technology are affecting social relationships, human abilities, even truth. And of course, as we know, democracies and society based on truth depend upon truth. And I think that obviously Facebook and social media, which was another part of my study, was one aspect of it, kind of showed that the corporate world of social media has really had an effect on the idea of what is true and what is not, and how students can decide what is true and where they should go for truth seeking. Okay. I think I'm done.